Chapter 1: The Quiet Before Names. There were nights when Daniel Mercer remained at his desk long after the last of the newsroom lights had dimmed and the cleaning crew had passed through with their slow carts and polite nods. The building would settle into a different rhythm then, as if it were exhaling after holding its breath all day. The hum of the servers became more noticeable. The air conditioning sighed intermittently through the vents. Somewhere in the distance, an elevator cable groaned softly in its shaft. From the 12th floor, the city of Port Aurora looked orderly at night. Glass towers reflected one another in endless repetition, and the harbor beyond them glowed with scattered constellations of anchored ships. Headlights traced delicate lines along the highways, moving in patient streams that suggested purpose, direction, certainty. Daniel often wondered how much of that certainty was illusion. He had built his life on the belief that truth, while sometimes buried, was ultimately retrievable. It might require patience. It might demand sacrifice. But it existed, fixed and waiting like a bone beneath layers of earth. At 48, he no longer moved with the restless urgency that had defined his early career. In his 20s, he had chased corruption stories with a reckless kind of hunger, sleeping in his car outside courthouses, bribing archivists with bad coffee, and knocking on doors in neighborhoods where curtains twitched at the sight of strangers. He had believed that exposing wrongdoing was enough, that once the public knew, justice would follow naturally. 15 years of investigative reporting had tempered that belief. Justice did not always follow. Sometimes it limped. Sometimes it detoured. Occasionally, it vanished altogether. Still he stayed. The Harbor Ledger was not the most powerful paper in the country, but it was respected. Its readers expected rigor, not spectacle. Daniel had earned his reputation there, steady, thorough, difficult to intimidate. He wasn't flashy. He didn't shout on television panels. He wrote carefully constructed narratives supported by documentation so solid that lawsuits rarely survived first review. His desk reflected that temperament. Stacks of files arranged with near-military precision. Yellow legal pads filled with neat, slanted handwriting. A corkboard behind him dotted with photographs, timelines, and clipped articles connected by thin lines of red thread. Routine anchored him. Every morning began the same way. He woke at 6, brewed coffee in the small stainless steel pot he had owned since his marriage, and stood by the narrow kitchen window while the harbor shifted from charcoal to silver. He would scan headlines on his tablet, circling stories that felt unfinished. After a brief run along the docks, steady pace, measured breathing, he would shower, dress in muted tones, and take the subway downtown. He liked observing people during that commute. Construction workers dozing against metal poles. Young analysts scrolling through financial news. Nurses and scrubs reviewing patient charts. Their lives intersected silently, briefly, before diverging into separate responsibilities. He often wondered which of them understood how decisions made in distant boardrooms shaped their routines. That question had begun to press more heavily on him in recent years. Port Aurora had grown wealthier, more polished. New glass towers replaced old brick warehouses. Boutique hotels rose where factories once stood. Politicians praised economic revitalization while quietly approving tax incentives that funneled public funds toward private developers. Daniel had covered those incentives. He had interviewed city council members who spoke earnestly about progress. He had interviewed displaced residents who spoke about rising rents and evaporating communities. He saw the seams. But lately, something else tugged at him. A sense that the visible seams were merely surface fractures above deeper structural shifts. It wasn't paranoia. He rejected that word whenever it surfaced in his mind. It was pattern recognition. An instinct sharpened over years of watching cause and effect misalign. On a Tuesday evening in late October, that instinct stirred again. The newsroom had thinned early because of a regional holiday. Rain tapped softly against the windows, streaking the skyline into blurred watercolor. Daniel remained seated at his desk, reviewing public procurement contracts tied to a defense subcontractor. It was not particularly thrilling work, but it was necessary. Contracts, he believed, were honest in their numbers if nowhere else. Arthur Levin, his editor, emerged from his office carrying his coat. "You're still here," Arthur observed, though there was no surprise in his voice. Daniel glanced at the clock. "Nearly 9. "Almost done," he replied. Arthur studied him for a moment. "You've been circling the same companies for weeks." "They keep winning bids," Daniel said mildly. Arthur's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. "Companies that win bids aren't necessarily criminals." "No," Daniel agreed. "But patterns deserve attention." Arthur slipped on his coat. "Just make sure you're chasing something real." Daniel nodded. After Arthur left, the building quieted further. The rain intensified, drumming against the glass. Daniel leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes briefly, letting the sound settle around him. He remembered his first major investigation, a municipal water contamination cover-up. He had been 32. Idealistic. Furious on behalf of families whose children had grown ill. When the story broke, resignations followed. Policy changed. For a brief moment, the machinery of accountability had functioned exactly as he'd imagined. He had carried that moment like a talisman through darker years. His phone buzzed softly against the desk, pulling him from memory. An email notification. He almost ignored it. Late-night tips were often incoherent or malicious. But something in the subject line, no words, just a blank space, made him pause. He opened it. There was no greeting. No signature. Just a short message. The meetings mattered. Look at who was there. Below it, a scanned attachment. Daniel frowned and enlarged the image. It appeared to be a photocopied document. The header read, Halcyon Institute Annual Strategic Symposium. The date was from several years prior. The location, a private estate outside Annapolis, Maryland. Beneath the header was a list of attendees. At first, the names meant little. But then his eyes caught one that did. A former senator who had chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee. A figure often described as incorruptible. Daniel sat up straighter. Another name. A CEO whose company held lucrative federal contracts. Another. A federal appellate judge known for decisive rulings in complex financial cases. The list continued, 27 names in total. Powerful, respected, diverse in background yet unified in influence. Daniel scrolled back to the email body. The meetings mattered. Look at who was there. His pulse quickened slightly. He ran a quick search for the Halcyon Institute. The results were sparse. A minimalist website describing it as a policy research collaborative dedicated to fostering dialogue between public and private leadership. No staff directory. No detailed mission statement. Just abstract language about innovation and alignment. Alignment. The word lingered. He downloaded the attachment and printed it, watching as the page emerged slowly from the machine. The ink was slightly faded, as if copied multiple times. He studied the list again. Why send this to him? He checked the sender's address. Encrypted. Untraceable through standard methods. The rain softened outside. The newsroom felt suddenly smaller. Daniel told himself not to leap ahead. Powerful individuals attended conferences constantly. Think tanks, fundraisers, retreats. Proximity did not imply conspiracy. Still, he reached for a yellow pad and began writing the names in his own handwriting, spacing them carefully down the page. Beside each name, he noted recent controversies, legislative decisions, major court rulings. A pattern did not immediately reveal itself. But there was an uneasy symmetry in their collective reach: law, finance, media, defense, technology. It was a cross-section of influence. He glanced at the time. Nearly 10:30. Instead of leaving, he opened archived news databases and began searching for significant national investigations or regulatory shifts occurring around the date of the symposium. It was meticulous work. Slow. He preferred it that way. An hour passed. Then another. He discovered that during the same week as the Maryland meeting, a federal inquiry into offshore holdings by several defense contractors had abruptly narrowed its scope. A whistleblower who had been scheduled to testify withdrew, citing personal reasons. Daniel leaned back, exhaling slowly. Coincidence was possible. Likely even. But coincidence accumulated. He closed his laptop and stood, stretching his stiff shoulders. Through the window, the harbor lights shimmered against dark water. Ships remained anchored, steady and silent. He thought about Emma. She had called earlier that week to describe a lecture on environmental regulation. She had sounded animated, hopeful. Systems can be redesigned, she'd insisted. They're not immutable. He had smiled at her conviction. Standing alone in the dim newsroom now, Daniel felt the familiar tension between hope and realism tightening in his chest. He gathered the printed page and slipped it into his leather folder. As he turned off his desk lamp, he sensed, not danger, not yet, but the faint shift of something beneath the surface of his orderly world. Like a current changing direction far below a calm sea. He did not know, walking out into the damp October night, that the list in his folder would alter the shape of his days. He only knew that a simple question had begun to form, quiet but insistent. Why were they all in the same room? Chapter 2, The Disruption of Silence. Daniel did not sleep much that night. The rain had stopped by the time he reached his apartment, but the pavement still shimmered under streetlights, reflecting fractured gold patterns that trembled each time a car passed. Inside, the air felt unusually still, as though the room itself were waiting for something to be said. He placed the leather folder on his kitchen table and stood over it for a moment without opening it. There was a discipline he had learned early in his career. Never let a lead become a conclusion too quickly. Excitement distorted judgment. Fear did the same. He poured himself a glass of water, not wine. He wanted clarity. When he finally opened the folder again, the printed page seemed almost ordinary. No official seal. No dramatic language. Just a list of names beneath a formal header. He sat down and began again, this time more methodically. He opened his laptop and created a spreadsheet. Columns for date, location, attendees, concurrent national events, judicial decisions, regulatory shifts, corporate mergers, unexplained resignations. It was tedious work, slow. But patterns rarely revealed themselves in dramatic flashes. They emerged through repetition. By 2 in the morning, he had cross-referenced 7 of the names with significant legal developments that occurred within 30 days of the Maryland Symposium. A federal antitrust probe into a telecommunications conglomerate quietly settled. A major environmental lawsuit was dismissed on procedural grounds. A high-ranking prosecutor recused himself from a financial fraud case citing conflict of interest. Daniel rubbed his eyes. Each incident on its own could be explained. Settlements happened. Cases were dismissed. Recusals were routine. But the proximity unsettled him. He printed additional pages and taped them to the corkboard in his home office. Red string began to stretch between dates and faces. It felt dramatic, almost theatrical, and he disliked that about it. Real investigations were rarely so visually compelling. Still, the web grew. At dawn, exhausted, he lay on his couch rather than his bed, staring at the ceiling where faint cracks traced unpredictable paths. He told himself to rest, but his mind continued mapping connections in quiet loops. When he finally drifted into shallow sleep, he dreamed of a long dining table beneath a chandelier. The faces around it were blurred, indistinct. He could hear voices speaking calmly, discussing outcomes as if they were menu options. He woke with a dry mouth and a lingering unease. The next morning at the office, he approached Arthur Levin's door with the folder tucked beneath his arm. Arthur was already there, reading through overnight wire updates. He glanced up as Daniel entered. "You look terrible," Arthur observed. "Good morning to you too," Daniel replied, closing the door behind him. Arthur leaned back in his chair. "What is it?" Daniel placed the printed guest list on the desk without commentary. Arthur read silently. His brow furrowed almost imperceptibly. "Halcyon Institute," Arthur murmured. "Doesn't ring a bell." "It barely exists online," Daniel said. "But look at the names." Arthur scanned the list again. He recognized them, of course. Anyone in their profession would. "These are conference attendees," Arthur said cautiously. "Yes," Daniel agreed. "But the timing is curious." He laid out his preliminary correlations, dates aligned with investigations that had stalled or shifted direction. Arthur listened without interrupting, fingers steepled beneath his chin. When Daniel finished, there was a long silence. "Correlation isn't causation," Arthur said carefully. "I know. And if we imply wrongdoing without proof." "I'm not implying anything yet," Daniel interrupted, more sharply than he intended. He took a breath. "I'm saying there's enough here to justify deeper inquiry." Arthur studied him. "You're proposing what, exactly?" "I want to map every halcyon event for the last decade," Daniel said. "Cross-reference with major legal and regulatory inflection points. If there's nothing there, we drop it. And if there is?" Daniel held Arthur's gaze. "Then we have something larger than any story we've run in years." Arthur exhaled slowly. "You understand who these people are?" "Yes." "You understand the paper's exposure if this turns out to be smoke?" "Yes." Arthur leaned back further, staring at the ceiling for a moment as if consulting an invisible ledger of risks. 2 weeks, he said finally. Quietly. "No drafts. No external inquiries yet." Daniel nodded. "And Daniel," Arthur added, voice softer, "if this starts to feel unstable, you step back." Daniel did not promise. He returned to his desk with a focused calm that surprised him. The newsroom buzzed around him. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, televisions murmuring cable commentary. No one else knew that beneath the ordinary churn of daily reporting, a quieter line of inquiry had begun. He requested archived tax filings for the Halcyon Institute. The paperwork was sparse but not non-existent. Annual expenditures listed strategic consultations and logistical coordination. Large sums moved through intermediary foundations. He tracked one foundation to a philanthropic trust managed by a former federal judge, another name on the list. He tracked another to a venture capital firm specializing in defense technologies. Each discovery was incremental, almost disappointingly mundane in isolation. Yet together they suggested an infrastructure designed for discretion. Late that afternoon, his phone buzzed with a number he did not recognize. He let it ring once, twice, then answered. Daniel Mercer. Pause. You're looking at Halcyon, a woman's voice said quietly. He stiffened. Who is this? Another pause, longer this time. Someone who knows that you shouldn't. The line went dead. Daniel stared at his phone. Could be a prank. A colleague overhearing something. Coincidence. But the timing was too precise. He stood and walked to the newsroom window. Outside, traffic flowed normally. Pedestrians crossed streets. A delivery truck idled at the curb. The world looked unchanged. Yet something had shifted. That evening, he called Elena Ruiz. They had not spoken in nearly a year. She had moved from federal prosecution to private practice after what many described as strategic disagreements within the department. They agreed to meet the following night at a small cafe across the river, neutral ground. Elena arrived wearing a dark coat and minimal makeup. She looked more tired than he remembered, though her eyes remained sharp. You picked an interesting hobby, she said after he summarized what he'd found. So you've heard of Halcyon, Daniel said. She stirred her coffee slowly. Not officially. Unofficially? There were whispers, she admitted. Private convenings. Informal discussions between sectors. About what? About risk, she said. Daniel leaned forward. Risk of what? Exposure. Instability. Litigation that could ripple outward. Are you saying they coordinated outcomes? I'm saying, she replied carefully, that powerful people prefer predictability. Her gaze held his. And unpredictability, she added, often comes in the form of investigations. He felt a tightening in his chest. Why wasn't this exposed before? Elena gave a faint, humorless smile. Expose it with what? Speculation? Half the attendees have impeccable public records. The rest control resources most institutions rely on. She leaned closer. Daniel, the system isn't a conspiracy in a dark room. It's relationships. Dinners. Shared priorities. Phone calls that never make transcripts. And Halcyon? A place where alignment can occur without optics. The word again. Alignment. He sat back, absorbing it. Do you think they crossed legal lines? He asked. Elena hesitated. I think legality can be interpreted creatively when the interpreters are in the room. They sat in silence for a moment. Drop it, she said finally, almost gently. He shook his head. She studied him with something like resignation. Then be precise, she said. Precision is your only protection. When Daniel left the cafe, the air felt colder than expected. The river reflected city lights in fractured ribbons. He walked slowly to his car, aware of his own footsteps in a way he hadn't been before. Over the next several days, the tension remained subtle but constant. Two colleagues stopped joking with him as freely. A senior reporter asked casually what he was digging into lately, her tone too light. Arthur called him into his office again. Have you spoken to anyone outside the paper? Arthur asked. Only an old contact. Arthur's jaw tightened slightly. Be careful who you involve. I am. Arthur studied him. Daniel, I need to know you're not chasing a phantom. Daniel hesitated. I don't know what I'm chasing yet, he admitted. That was the truth. He wasn't certain whether Halcyon represented corruption, influence, or simply proximity among elites. But the convergence was undeniable. And then, 3 days into his quiet investigation, something happened that removed the comfort of ambiguity. He returned home to find his apartment door slightly ajar. Not wide. Just enough to be wrong. His heart began to pound, not dramatically but steadily, insistently. He pushed the door open slowly. The living room appeared intact. Couch, coffee table, bookshelf. But the folder he had left on the kitchen counter was missing. He stepped further inside, scanning the space. No electronics were gone. His laptop remained on the desk. His television untouched. No drawers overturned. Just the folder. Daniel stood very still. It could have been misplaced. He searched carefully, bedroom, office, bathroom. Nothing. The folder containing the printed guest list and his handwritten notes was gone. He felt the air thin in his lungs. This was no longer abstract. Someone had entered his home not to steal valuables but to remove paper. He locked the door and leaned against it, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Fear did not arrive as panic. It arrived as clarity. This was real. And the silence around Halcyon was not accidental. He reached for his phone to call the police, then paused. What would he report? A missing folder? No signs of forced entry. No obvious theft. He could already hear the polite skepticism. Instead, he called Elena. "They're aware," he said. There was no need to explain further. "I told you," she replied softly. He closed his eyes. "What now?" he asked. There was a long pause. "Now," she said, "you decide whether the story is worth what it might cost." After the call ended, Daniel walked to the window overlooking the harbor. The water was calm. Ships anchored in orderly rows. On the surface, everything appeared stable. But beneath that surface, currents moved in directions unseen. He pressed his palm lightly against the glass, grounding himself in its cool solidity. He had crossed an invisible line. The disruption had begun, not loudly, not publicly, but with the quiet removal of paper and the unspoken message it carried. He understood now that whatever Halcyon represented, it was not meant to be examined. And that knowledge, more than the missing folder, unsettled him. Because silence, when enforced, is never neutral. Chapter 3: The Weight of Revelation. 2 days after the break-in, Daniel moved through his routines with deliberate precision. He woke at 6. He brewed coffee. He ran along the docks. But the familiarity of those motions no longer steadied him. Each step felt like an act of defiance against a reality that had quietly shifted. He replayed the scene in his apartment again and again. The slightly open door. The undisturbed electronics. The absence of forced entry. The missing folder. It wasn't theft. It was curation. Someone had known exactly what to remove. He told no one at the paper except Arthur. Arthur listened without interrupting, fingers pressed flat against his desk. "You're certain you didn't misplace it?" Arthur asked carefully. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I am certain." Arthur leaned back, the lines around his mouth deepening. "If this becomes official, if we report a targeted break-in, we escalate." Daniel nodded. "And if we don't?" Arthur asked. "Then we proceed quietly," Daniel replied. Arthur studied him for a long moment. "You're already on their radar," he said. "Quiet may no longer be an option." The phrase lingered in Daniel's mind long after he left the office. On their radar. It implied observation, monitoring, awareness. It implied that the inquiry had reached someone capable of responding. That night, instead of working from his apartment, Daniel returned to the newsroom after hours. He trusted the building's security more than his own locks. He rebuilt his notes from memory first, reconstructing the list of names, the dates, the correlations he had charted. His recall surprised him. Years of investigative work had trained him to internalize details instinctively. He could still see the names aligned in neat rows. But memory was not enough. He needed primary material. At 1:43 a.m., as the city sank into its deepest quiet, Daniel received another email from an encrypted address. No subject line. One attachment. PDF. He hesitated before opening it. Then he clicked. The document was longer than the first, 37 pages. Internal memoranda bearing the Halcyon Institute header. Meeting agendas. Expense allocations. Brief summaries of discussions. His pulse accelerated. The Maryland Symposium was only one of many. There had been annual gatherings stretching back over a decade, each in different secluded locations. Private estates, offshore conference centers, remote mountain lodges. Each meeting featured an evolving but overlapping roster of attendees. Daniel's eyes scanned the pages quickly at first, then more slowly as phrases began to crystallize. Coordinated response to regulatory volatility. Pre-litigation harmonization strategies. Narrative stabilization planning. The language was sterile, polished, devoid of overt wrongdoing. But beneath the euphemisms lay implication. He continued reading. Midway through the document, a section titled Post-Exposure Risk Containment included bullet points. Identification of non-essential liabilities. Judicial pathway analysis. Controlled accountability sequencing. Daniel leaned back, heart pounding in his ears. Controlled accountability sequencing. He whispered the phrase aloud. It suggested design. Intent. The idea that consequences could be structured, timed, allocated. He scrolled further. Then he saw it. An appendix labeled Case Reference, Aurora Financial Inquiry. Aurora Financial. Daniel remembered the case vividly. 5 years earlier, federal investigators had uncovered a web of offshore accounts tied to defense procurement contracts. Several mid-level executives had been indicted, but the broader investigation into executive leadership and board members had dissolved quietly. The appendix summarized internal discussion points from a halcyon meeting held 3 weeks before the inquiry narrowed. A paragraph caught his eye. Judicial trajectory indicates vulnerability at appellate level. Alignment through advisory channels recommended. Peripheral actors may be sufficient to demonstrate corrective posture. Daniel felt a chill move through him. Peripheral actors. Sacrificial layers. He reread the sentence twice. The implication was unmistakable. The smaller executives who had faced charges, publicly disgraced, professionally ruined, may have been the peripheral actors. He closed his eyes. This was no longer about proximity. It was about orchestration. He forced himself to continue reading. Further pages referenced media management strategies, informal briefings, off-the-record conversations, shaping narratives before indictments were announced. One memo detailed a judicial sentiment assessment of specific appellate judges. Names. Respected, tenured federal judges. Daniel felt the weight of the room pressing inward. He stood and walked to the window. The harbor lights shimmered in silence. The city appeared unaware that its institutions might be subtly calibrated behind closed doors. He returned to his desk and reopened the document. At the end of the PDF was a brief note. Additional records forthcoming. Verify integrity of channel. No signature. He leaned back in his chair, hands resting flat on the desk. The scope of it overwhelmed him, not because it was cinematic or dramatic, but because it was systemic. This was not a criminal syndicate operating outside the law. It was individuals within the law, adjusting its application. The next morning, Daniel met Elena again. He did not bring printed copies. He memorized key phrases instead. They chose a different cafe this time, farther from downtown. He recited the language quietly. Controlled accountability sequencing, he said. Elena's face drained slightly of color. That's internal phrasing, she murmured. You've heard it before? She hesitated. In another context, she said carefully. Informally. Meaning? Meaning there were cases where outcomes felt pre-negotiated. Daniel leaned forward. Negotiated by whom? She exhaled slowly. Not in a courtroom. Before it ever reached one. He watched her carefully. Do you think Halcyon facilitated that? Elena did not answer immediately. Instead, she stared at the surface of her coffee as if searching for clarity within it. I think, she said finally, that when people at the highest levels believe instability threatens the broader system, they justify intervention. Intervention that isn't public. Yes. Or legal. She met his eyes. Legality becomes flexible when everyone interpreting it is aligned. The word again. Aligned. Daniel felt a quiet anger stirring, not explosive but heavy. This isn't about preventing chaos, he said. It's about preventing accountability. Elena did not contradict him. Silence stretched between them. What will you do? She asked. I verify, Daniel replied. How? I find the source. That opportunity arrived sooner than expected. 2 nights later, Daniel received a text from an unknown number. He tried to send everything before he died. I have the rest. Attached was a location pin, an industrial storage facility on the outskirts of Port Aurora. No name. No instructions. He showed the message to Arthur. Arthur's expression hardened. This is reckless, he said. It's also the next step, Daniel replied. Arthur paced behind his desk. You don't go alone. The message says alone. Arthur stopped pacing. That's not a suggestion. Daniel held his gaze. If I bring anyone else, they won't show. Arthur exhaled sharply. Then at least leave your location active. Daniel nodded. Dusk settled heavily the evening he drove to the storage facility. The sky burned briefly orange before fading into bruised indigo. The facility sat beyond the city limits, surrounded by chain-link fencing and sodium vapor lights that cast everything in dull yellow. He parked near the far edge and stepped out, scanning the rows of metal doors. Unit C-17. He approached slowly. The door was partially raised. Inside, a single overhead bulb flickered. And beside a tall filing cabinet stood a woman in her early 30s. She looked exhausted. You're Daniel Mercer? She said quietly. Yes. My name is Mara Whitmore. The surname struck him instantly. Leonard Whitmore? He asked. She nodded. He sent you the first documents. Daniel felt a tightening in his chest. He died of a heart attack, he said carefully. Mara's expression shifted, something between grief and skepticism. That's what they said. The words hung in the air. She gestured toward the filing cabinet. He spent years compiling evidence, she continued. He thought someone needed to know how decisions were being shaped before the public ever saw them. Daniel swallowed. Why me? My father read your reporting, she said. He believed you documented systems, not just scandals. She opened the top drawer. Inside were neatly organized folders. Emails. Internal strategy drafts. Recorded calls from halcyon planning sessions. Daniel's pulse quickened. He was an accountant, Mara said softly. He tracked inconsistencies. Money routed through consulting firms. Legal retainers that spiked before key rulings. Why didn't he go public himself? She hesitated. He tried. A chill moved through Daniel. He said exposure required someone who understood narrative weight. Someone who wouldn't sensationalize it. She handed him a small external drive. Everything's here. In that moment, headlights flared outside the storage unit. Both of them turned toward the light. Mara's face tightened. They monitor patterns, she whispered. Daniel's heart began to pound. Go, she said urgently. There's a back exit. He hesitated only briefly before slipping the drive into his jacket. As he moved toward the rear door, he felt the magnitude of what he carried, not just data but confirmation. The guest list was not incidental. It was architectural. Outside, engines idled low and steady. Daniel stepped into the darkness behind the facility, breath sharp in the cold air. Behind him, the front of the unit slid shut. He did not look back. As he moved quickly through the unlit perimeter, one thought crystallized with terrifying clarity. The crimes themselves had always been visible. Fraud, manipulation, regulatory capture. But what he now held in his pocket suggested something far more unsettling. The crimes were curated, and the guest list was the design. Chapter 4, The Breaking Point. Daniel did not drive home immediately. He kept the headlights off until he was several blocks from the storage facility, navigating side streets guided only by memory and the faint wash of distant street lamps. His pulse had not yet settled. It thudded in his ears with a steady insistence, as though reminding him that what had happened was not theoretical. 2 vehicles had arrived. They had not been police cruisers. They had not used sirens. They had simply arrived. He merged onto the highway only after circling twice through residential streets to ensure he wasn't being followed. Even then, every pair of headlights behind him felt intentional. The external drive rested in the inner pocket of his jacket, pressing lightly against his ribs. The sensation was almost symbolic, like carrying a second heart, foreign and dangerous. By the time he reached downtown Port Aurora, the city had thinned into its late-night quiet. Bars were closing. Street sweepers hummed along curbs. Steam rose from subway grates in pale spirals. He did not go to his apartment. Instead, he drove directly to the underground garage beneath the harbor ledger and parked in Arthur's reserved spot. He sent a single text. We need to talk. Now. Arthur responded within 3 minutes. Come up. The newsroom was dark except for the dim security lighting and the faint glow from Arthur's office. Daniel entered without speaking and closed the door behind him. Arthur looked at him for a long moment before saying anything. You look like you've seen something irreversible. Daniel reached into his jacket and placed the external drive on the desk between them. I have. Arthur's eyes dropped to the device. Source. Whitmore's daughter. Arthur inhaled slowly. So it's authentic? I don't know yet, Daniel said. But it's consistent. Arthur gestured to the computer. Let's see. They worked side by side in silence as the files loaded. The drive contained folders organized by year. Inside each year were subfolders labeled by city: Aspen, Annapolis, Santa Fe, Key West. Arthur scrolled through the file tree without speaking. Daniel opened the first audio recording. A low murmur filled the room, voices in conversation, the clink of glassware, the faint hum of what sounded like a large dining hall. Then a voice emerged clearly. Calm, educated, familiar. Daniel recognized it instantly, a former cabinet secretary whose speeches he had quoted in past articles. We must be realistic about exposure vectors, the voice said. The inquiry cannot be allowed to metastasize. Another voice responded. Peripheral accountability should satisfy public demand. We don't need systemic destabilization. Arthur paused the audio. They stared at one another. No one said the obvious. Daniel clicked open a transcript file that accompanied the recording. It appeared to be meticulously prepared: speaker attributions, timestamps, contextual notes. The transcript referenced judicial trajectory analysis, media temperature assessments, and containment modeling. Arthur removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "This is deliberate," he said quietly. Daniel nodded. They continued reviewing. An email chain from 3 years earlier discussed a pending antitrust investigation into a major technology firm. One message read, "Appellate alignment appears feasible. Initial ruling may be adverse but reversible. Coordination recommended." Another email responded, "Ensure narrative groundwork prior to filing. Public sentiment volatility remains manageable." Arthur leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. "This isn't about avoiding crime," he said. "It's about managing consequence." Daniel felt something heavy settle in his chest. The crimes had never fully disappeared. They had been absorbed, structured, sequenced. Arthur stood and walked to the window, staring out at the dark skyline. "If we publish this," he said slowly, "we are not accusing individuals of isolated wrongdoing." Daniel understood. "We're exposing a mechanism." Arthur turned back toward him. "And mechanisms defend themselves." The weight of that statement filled the room. Daniel thought of Mara Whitmore, of the headlights outside the storage unit, of his apartment door slightly ajar. "They already know," Daniel said. Arthur's jaw tightened. "Yes," he replied. "They do." They spent the next 48 hours verifying. Audio forensic analysis confirmed the recordings were unaltered. Metadata from emails matched archival server patterns. Financial documents corresponded with publicly filed tax reports and legal retainers. Every layer they examined reinforced authenticity. Daniel felt less triumphant than he might have expected. Instead, he felt the slow, suffocating gravity of inevitability. By the third day, Arthur convened a confidential meeting with the paper's legal team. The attorneys reviewed the material with increasing tension. "This is combustible," one of them said. "It's documented," Arthur replied. "Documented orchestration," the attorney corrected. "Not necessarily illegal coordination." Daniel leaned forward. "Judges are referenced by name," he said. "Case trajectories discussed before rulings. Media strategies outlined prior to indictments." The attorney met his gaze. "That's influence," she said. "Influence isn't always prosecutable. But it is reportable," Daniel replied. Silence followed. The legal team requested time to assess exposure risk. Arthur granted it. That evening, Daniel returned to his apartment for the first time since retrieving the drive. He stood inside the doorway for several seconds before turning on the lights. Nothing appeared disturbed. Yet the space felt different, smaller, less private. He moved methodically, checking windows, closets, the hallway outside. He told himself he was being cautious, not paranoid. When his phone rang, he flinched despite himself. It was Emma. "Dad," she said. "Are you okay?" He hesitated. "Why wouldn't I be?" "I saw something online," she replied. "An opinion piece. It mentioned your name. Said you were chasing unfounded conspiracy threads." He felt his throat tighten. "How widely circulated?" "Widely enough that it reached my campus feed." He sat down slowly. "They're trying to discredit you," she said quietly. He had not wanted her involved in this reality. "It's noise," he replied carefully. "Is it?" Her voice trembled slightly. He closed his eyes. "Emma, listen to me. Sometimes when you look closely at power, it pushes back." There was a long pause. "Are you in danger?" she asked. He considered lying. Instead, he answered honestly. "I don't know." Silence stretched between them. "I'm proud of you," she said finally. "But I'm scared." He swallowed. "So am I." After the call ended, Daniel sat alone in the dim light of his living room. Fear felt different now. Less abstract. Less intellectual. It had shape. It had consequence. He walked to the window overlooking the harbor. The water moved in slow, black currents. Ships remained anchored, unaware of the human negotiations unfolding in offices and conference rooms above them. He understood something with sudden clarity. The decision before him was not whether the evidence was compelling. It was whether he was willing to endure what publication would trigger. The legal team reconvened the next morning. Their assessment was measured. The material demonstrates coordinated discussion among powerful individuals regarding case management and public narrative, the lead attorney said. It stops short of explicit admission of criminal conspiracy. Daniel nodded. "We're not alleging secret indictments," he said. "We're exposing structural manipulation." Arthur looked at him carefully. "You understand what that means for you personally?" Daniel did. He had already begun receiving anonymous messages, some threatening, others mocking. Invitations to speak at industry events had quietly evaporated. A radio appearance was canceled without explanation. The isolation Elena had warned about was unfolding. Arthur exhaled slowly. "We publish," he said. The word landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Daniel felt both relief and dread. They structured the exposé as a multi-part investigative series. Part 1, the guest list. Part 2, the language of alignment. Part 3, managed accountability. Daniel wrote slowly, deliberately. He avoided sensationalism. He avoided adjectives that could be construed as exaggeration. He quoted directly from transcripts. He contextualized each referenced case with documented public timelines. He let the evidence speak. The night before publication, he remained in the newsroom alone. The final draft glowed on his screen. He read it once more from beginning to end. He thought of Whitmore, of Mara, of the executives who had fallen while their superiors remained untouched, of judges whose reputations had shielded them from scrutiny. He thought of Emma's voice on the phone. And he understood that this was the breaking point, not a moment of violence or dramatic confrontation, but a quiet decision to press send. Arthur entered just before midnight. "Ready?" he asked. Daniel nodded. Arthur placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. "Once this goes live," he said, "there's no pulling it back." Daniel met his eyes. "I know." Arthur returned to his office to coordinate timing with the digital team. Daniel hovered over the keyboard. He felt no triumph, no adrenaline surge, only the profound stillness that precedes irreversible action. He clicked. The article published at 12:01 a.m. Within minutes, traffic surged. Comments flooded in. Social media ignited. By 12:17 a.m., Daniel's phone began vibrating continuously. He silenced it. He stood and walked to the window. The city looked unchanged. But somewhere, in boardrooms, in private homes, in carefully guarded inboxes, shockwaves were forming. He knew retaliation would follow. Legal threats, media counter-narratives, character assassination. He also knew that once the guest list was public, it could not be erased. Names had power. But names exposed lost some of it. As he watched the harbor lights flicker against dark water, Daniel understood that the breaking point was not destruction. It was revelation. And revelation, once released, could not be invited back into silence. Chapter 5. The Aftermath of Names. The first 48 hours after publication unfolded like a controlled explosion. Not loud, not chaotic, controlled. Daniel had expected outrage, denials, possibly even immediate injunctions attempting to suppress distribution. Instead, what emerged at first was something colder, coordinated calm. Official statements appeared within hours. Several of the individuals named in the series acknowledged attending halcyon gatherings but described them as policy symposiums focused on public-private dialogue. One former cabinet secretary characterized the reporting as a fundamental misunderstanding of the collaborative process required to maintain national stability. A federal appellate judge released a brief statement affirming that judicial independence remains uncompromised and protected by oath. No one denied the meetings. No one denied the transcripts. They reframed them. Daniel sat at his desk reading the responses with a tightening in his jaw. The comments beneath the article split predictably, some readers calling it courageous journalism, others dismissing it as speculative alarmism. The truth, as always, did not move in clean lines. By the third day, congressional leaders announced a preliminary inquiry into the Halcyon Institute's activities. It sounded significant. It was less so upon closer inspection. The language was cautious. Scope undefined. The markets barely reacted. Life in Port Aurora continued. Yet beneath the surface, currents shifted. Daniel felt it in subtler ways first. A longtime source in the Department of Commerce stopped returning his calls. An invitation to moderate a university panel was withdrawn due to scheduling conflicts. Two colleagues in the newsroom avoided eye contact in the hallway. The isolation Elena had described did not feel theatrical. It felt administrative. Quiet distancing. Arthur called him into his office late one afternoon. "Legal threats are coming," Arthur said plainly. "Defamation claims. Breach of confidentiality allegations." "On what grounds?" Daniel asked. Arthur handed him a printed letter. The language was predictably aggressive, asserting mischaracterization, implying reputational harm, demanding retraction. "They're testing our resolve," Arthur said. Daniel nodded slowly. "Will we hold?" Arthur looked older than he had weeks earlier. "Yes," he said. "But this won't be brief." Daniel left the office feeling the weight of duration. Exposure was not a moment. It was an endurance. 2 weeks after publication, the first resignation occurred. A board member of a major defense contractor stepped down, citing personal reasons. No admission of wrongdoing. No acknowledgement of halcyon. Still, it was movement. News outlets beyond Port Aurora began picking up the story. National panels debated the ethical boundaries of elite convenings. Editorials questioned whether influence, even if technically legal, could erode public trust when exercised invisibly. Daniel watched from the periphery. He avoided television interviews. He declined podcast invitations. He wanted the reporting to remain central, not his persona. Yet the personal cost deepened. One evening, he found a handwritten note slipped beneath his apartment door. "You've destabilized more than you understand." No signature. No threat explicitly. Just implication. He stood in his kitchen holding the paper, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. Destabilized. The word lingered. He thought of Elena's earlier comment, that powerful individuals justified intervention in the name of stability. Perhaps they believed it. Perhaps they believed that managing accountability prevented systemic collapse. The complexity unsettled him more than outright villainy would have. Because if they believed they were preserving order, then exposure could be framed as recklessness. He folded the note and placed it in a drawer beside Whitmore's original message. He did not report it. He was no longer certain where reporting ended and escalation began. Emma visited in early winter. The air had turned sharp and metallic, the harbor wind slicing cleanly through coats and scarves. She arrived with a duffel bag and a tension in her posture he recognized immediately. They embraced longer than usual in the doorway. Inside, she moved through the apartment slowly, as if assessing it for unseen fractures. "It feels smaller," she said quietly. He smiled faintly. "It's always been small." "No," she replied. "It feels exposed." He understood. Over dinner, she asked careful questions. "Do you regret publishing it?" she asked at one point. He considered the question fully. "No," he said. "But I understand the cost more clearly now. Is it worth it?" He looked at her, at the conviction that had once been untested. "Truth doesn't guarantee justice," he said slowly. "But silence guarantees nothing changes." She nodded, though her eyes carried worry. Later that night, as she slept in the spare room, Daniel stood again at the window overlooking the harbor. The water reflected the city lights in trembling lines. He realized that what unsettled him most was not the backlash, nor the threats, nor even the uncertainty of legal battles. It was the realization that the system had not shattered. It had absorbed the impact. Investigations opened. Committees formed. Yet the architecture remained largely intact. Halcyon's website went offline within days of publication. Corporate filings suggested the nonprofit had dissolved quietly. But Daniel knew dissolution on paper did not equate to disappearance. Influence did not vanish. It reconfigured. Months passed. Congressional hearings produced measured exchanges and limited subpoenas. A few lower-level officials admitted to informal discussions, but denied any inappropriate coordination. One appellate judge announced early retirement. Several executives stepped down under vague language about transitions. Yet no sweeping indictments followed. The mechanism Daniel had exposed proved resilient. He wrestled privately with disappointment. He had not expected immediate transformation, but he had hoped for more visible accountability. One evening he met Elena again. They chose a park bench overlooking the river rather than a cafe. "You shook them," she said. "Not enough," he replied. She studied the water. "You exposed a pattern," she said. "Patterns are harder to prosecute than individuals." He nodded. "Will it change anything?" he asked. She considered the question. "Yes," she said finally. "Not because it dismantled the structure, but because now it's seen." Seen by whom? By people who will enter those rooms one day. He thought about that. "You can't unring a bell," she added. They sat in silence. Daniel realized that perhaps the work of journalism was not demolition. It was illumination. And illumination did not guarantee collapse. It guaranteed visibility. Arthur retired the following spring. The newsroom held a modest gathering in his honor. He stood before the staff, shoulders slightly stooped, and spoke about the responsibility of documentation. "We are not activists," he said. "We are witnesses." His gaze drifted briefly toward Daniel. "Witnessing matters," Arthur concluded. Afterward, in his office surrounded by half-packed boxes, Arthur handed Daniel a small framed note. It was Whitmore's original handwritten line. They weren't just guests. "You carried this further than most would," Arthur said quietly. Daniel felt an unexpected surge of emotion. "I'm not sure how far it went," he admitted. Arthur smiled faintly. "Far enough that they noticed." In the years that followed, the Halcyon story became a reference point. Students cited it in ethics seminars. Policy analysts referenced it in papers about institutional capture. Law reviews debated the fine line between influence and interference. New names rose in government. New corporations expanded. New crises emerged. The guest list changed. Daniel remained at the Harbor Ledger, though his assignments shifted again. He mentored younger reporters now, teaching them to recognize patterns rather than chase spectacle. Sometimes, late at night, he would revisit the archived recordings. The calm voices discussing controlled accountability sequencing. He no longer listened with anger. He listened with clarity. The system had not been a singular villain. It had been a network of shared assumptions, about stability, about control, about who was permitted to absorb consequence. He understood that exposing it had not ended it, but it had forced it into light. And light altered behavior even if subtly. One evening years later, Daniel stood again at his window overlooking the harbor. Cargo ships moved slowly toward port, guided by invisible currents and unseen calculations. He thought about the first email he had received. The meetings mattered. Look at who was there. He had looked. He had shown others. And though the machinery of power continued to turn, it did so now under a thin but persistent layer of scrutiny. He understood something then with quiet acceptance. The most dangerous systems were not those that committed crimes in darkness. They were the ones that invited themselves to dinner, smiled politely, and decided in advance who would fall. And somewhere, in a private room lit by chandeliers and careful language, a new list was being written, aware now that one day someone might look at it and ask the same question he once did. Why were they all in the same room?